Welcome to another episode of the Watchdog on Mint Press. As always, we are going against the grain with our coverage of stories which the mainstream media regularly and routinely ignore. For that reason, I hope you can support us on YouTube by liking and subscribing to the channel and commenting below, and also supporting us on Patreon. Today, we are joined by the mysterious but very influential Palestine Action. Tell us, please, what is Palestine Action?
So thanks for having us on. Palestine Action is a direct action network. We launched in July 2020, and we seek to take direct action to end British complicity with Israeli apartheid. We're mostly focused on Elbit Systems, which is Israel's largest arms company, and taking direct action to shut them down in Britain.
We know that the relationship when it comes to arms between groups like the Zionist lobby prior to the foundation of Israel were seen with Chaim Weizmann's technique of turning starch, potatoes, corn, and other types of foods into acetone, which was used in World War I for the British military. This was part of the basis upon which Chaim Weizmann built up his influence, which allowed him to procure the Balfour Declaration off of the British government. So the roots of weaponry relationships between Israel and Britain are deep, and there's really a straight line in those relationships. In terms of these moves to shut down arms companies to try and stop that supply, what are the precedents which came before Palestine Action?
I think for us, one of the main inspirations and precedents would be the Raytheon 9 in Derry in the occupied 6 counties. This was a group of people who went in and kind of very instinctively went into a Raytheon factory whilst Lebanon was being bombed, and went in and without necessarily much of a plan, caused as much infrastructure damage, threw computers out of the window, stayed there, got arrested by the police, and then crucially went through a court process that they won, that they were found not guilty under the law of necessity. They were preventing the greater crime. And then what happened subsequent to that was another 9 women went into that factory, did the same, won their court case. And at that point, Raytheon were, well, we can't stay. Yeah, we've got no safety in this place. And for us, I think that's one of the sort of main precedents, and actually a factory being lost. And one of the things I would add to that, and maybe it's something we get onto later, there's those kind of high profile actions, but actually the other thing is the community response, the people in Derry, every regular people coming out and stopping that happening. And, you know, we've seen that, and we can talk about that more in depth. It needs that further community response. And for us, those high profile actions are the kind of the start off before a campaign comes. I think there's other examples of successful cases. Maybe Huda wants to talk about Edo.
Yeah, so Edo, which is another arms company in Brighton, I think it was in 2009 during Israel's bombing of Gaza. And again, activists went inside and dismantled the factory basically, and destroyed their infrastructure again. And again, they were found not guilty based on necessity. So actually, I think people often think when we do these things that we're doing it to defy the law, or we're breaking the law in the process. But we would always say that we're not breaking the law. What we're doing is actually rooted in law, and it's a lawful act to do something to prevent the great crime, to act to save lives. And often what these companies are doing is criminal, and that can come out a lot in the court process.
So this kind of action that you're talking about, what were the sort of trajectories of your own lives that led you to do this kind of activity?
Yeah, should I start?
Yeah.
So for me, I come from a Palestinian and Iraqi background. My father is Palestinian, and my father's family were, brutally forced out of Palestine in 1967. He was a young child at the time when the Israeli military came and started shooting into his house. And the way that they escaped was basically by crawling through the back of their own home with just the clothes they had on their backs, no shoes on, and had to, basically run for their lives, and eventually made their way over to Iraq. And actually, my great grandfather was shot and killed by a British soldier during the British Mandate of Palestine, shortly after the Balfour Declaration, which you've mentioned before, but basically when the Foreign Secretary of this government allowed for the ethnic cleansing and called for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine by calling for a Jewish homeland in historic Palestine. And I've been involved, actually, I was always, political growing up, as you can imagine, that type of background, but I really became more involved after I went out to Greece during the refugee crisis. And I was in Lesbos. I was supposed to go for a week. I ended up staying there for a month and then going back for another couple of months. And what I saw it just stuck with me. And it's hard not to have, for those things, when you see it in reality, to have an impact. There were thousands of people coming in on the shores. People were dying on the shores of Greece. People suffering from hypothermia. I became literally a medic there without having any medical experience because of the lack of volunteers or organizations, which I'd always kind of respected before then. These NGOs would go out and they were not offering the support that people needed. And I just look into those people's eyes and I just thought the only difference, between me and them or my family was that I had a British passport. So I came back and was doing a range of campaigning and discovered that my own University of Manchester, was investing millions into companies like Caterpillar, which supply the Israeli army with bulldozers, which are then armored and used to destroy Palestinian communities. And it was just horrific. When your eyes are open, you kind of see all of it. And I was seeing how my own university, which I was paying tuition fees towards, was using that money into the destruction of people's lives in Palestine. So I became very active in campaigning against that. And it took 4 years for them to divest, but they still have numerous connections, with their, they have a graphene, famous for their graphene, which actually we know that composites of that are being tested with the Israeli Air Force. They send students out to study on illegal settlements with an exchange program with Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And I'd become involved in then looking at how all universities were kind of involved in this, and discovered that they were investing £450 million. Councils, pension funds invest billions of pounds into companies such as this. And I got involved in national campaigning and lobbying several MPs on calling for an arms embargo, got involved in Labour. And it just felt like everything that was happening, even the small successes that were happening on the way, it just wasn't a match for the severity of Israel's apartheid regime and how deeply complicit this country is. And that's when, I really started to get more interested in taking direct action, which is much more going to the root cause of what is happening. You can't look at the refugee crisis and not look at imperialism or the arms trade. It's all connected. And when you know that people are suffering or being murdered by these weapons, it's hard not to act in such a way that or act with the urgency that these situations deserve. And I think that means going out to those arms companies and making sure that they can't operate, because politicians, etc., tried numerous times, and even to ask them to consider an arms embargo, they always come up with the same responses. And we saw it in May as well. There was hundreds of thousands of people who signed the petition, a government petition calling for sanctions. And I didn't get past 20 minutes of that debate because it was just painful just to see how much they managed to take away from that issue. And then they start talking about recognizing Palestine, which we know is a scapegoat for not actually taking action on these issues. So for me, direct action was the most logical and really the only step which was left, I felt, to actually try and get meaningful change.
For me, I think I trace it back to childhood. So I was a Catholic as a child. I had a strong anti-war sentiment, and also strong sentiment around Jesus, a Palestinian, turning over the tables of the money changers. And I think that was with me as a child, and also reference to the situation in Ireland. There was a strong preaching that I'd heard on that. And then I think latterly, as I became an adult, I had that anti-war stance, and I marched with a million other people against the Iraq war. And I saw the futility, to be honest, of that. Yeah, 1 million people marching. And when I hear Huda talk about her family in Iraq and what happened, when I read those stories, a bit of me feels guilty that that's all I did, actually, and feeling that they didn't achieve anything. And certainly, you know, people in England talk about, oh, well, it created this movement and did this and that, but it didn't do anything actually for those people suffering. And I said, when Huda talks about her family in Baghdad, I'm like, really, it needed to do more. I then was involved in environmental activism of various kinds, more mainstream stuff. But I think ultimately, in terms of this, I lived near an Elbit factory. I lived in Kent near a factory, found out about what was happening there, and a group of people come together and started taking direct action. And for me, that power of feeling like I actually had the power to do something, to not appeal to somebody else, to a government. And once I discovered more around, again, referencing the British state, the Balfour Agreement, you know, I'm not going to appeal to these people. I'm not going to appeal or stand outside the Israeli embassy. I've done it, but I'm not going to do it anymore because they ain't going to change their mind. And once I'd taken a form of direct action with a group of people in a factory and saw it shut down and said that they're not producing anything today, for me, that was a kind of like a crucial awakening and going, we do have the power as people. And also then being involved in wider movements, environmental movements, seeing what happened with Extinction Rebellion, seeing those things for me became a thing of going, no, more and more people understand this. And it's one of those moments in history. And there's been plenty of moments through history when we look at that and understanding that, you know, we can win, you know, if we concentrate on those things that cause disruption to these companies, you know, that show that we're prepared to sacrifice ourselves, that provide an ongoing dilemma to the state and to these companies as to whether it's viable for them to carry on, whether their reputation is being tarnished enough. For me, it then became evident that this is what I should be doing and encouraging others to do so as well.
So in a way, it seems you are both talking about a sort of community-enforced BDS. Elbit Systems gets the majority of your actions, I've noticed. What is Elbit Systems?
So Elbit is Israel's largest private arms company, and they literally market their weapons. They build a range of weapons, and they're most notoriously known for their drones, as Israel is. And they actually market their weapons as battle tested or field tested, but essentially they've been tested on the captive population of Gaza. And they have several sites here in Britain. They've got 10 sites across Britain, 5 factories, two offices. They call both of them their headquarters. And they operate in 3 different Royal Air Force sites as well here. But they are literally building weapons across Britain on our doorsteps, which are then exported to other oppressive regimes across the world. So for Israel's arms trade, because Israel's apartheid regime is built on the domination and control of the Palestinian people. It means that, as you mentioned before from Hayden Wiseman, these technologies are then developed and exported to other oppressive regimes across the world. So things from drones, which we've seen be used time and time again against the people of Gaza, but also across the world, tanks, guns, bullets. In terms of the weaponry, they are literally Israel's largest arms companies. They produce majority of the weapons that we are seeing being used against people in Gaza. Or when we see what happened in May, for example, again, it's the same companies who profit from the massacre of the Palestinian people. And also for us, we focus on Elbit because the messaging, there's a number of reasons, but also the messaging around it is clear. When you talk about an Israeli arms company who tests their weapons on Palestinians, it's as simple as that. For people, majority of people would understand how that is quite wrong, and not just wrong, it's quite sickening to hear. But also because we want to be focused in terms of our targets, because as you know, there are a number of companies who profit from the death and destruction of people across the world and have a complete disregard for human life when it comes to making profits. But for us, we want to win. We want to have a significant impact on Elbit Systems to eventually force them to shut down in this country and then hopefully in other places, but also to send a message to other companies that you cannot get away with this, and that we do have power. So we've decided to focus our resources mostly on targeting Elbit Systems.
I think I would just add to that. Yeah, for me, I'm not particularly clever or intellectual, but it's really easy and simple with Elbit Systems. They're the most evil of the evil. I think I'd said it somewhere before on one of our videos that, even HSBC Bank, not known for being particularly moral, won't invest in them. And when you have this as a simple target and easy to understand, this is what brings in more people to our movement. And more people become interested in the Palestinian cause from the environment movement, from maybe slightly surprisingly for us, from the animal rights movement and from other movements, is they get it, right? It's really simple. This company, what they do is so evil. It's not a sort of sideways target that requires a bit of, thought to get it. And therefore, more and more people join us and understand that. And hopefully those more sort of, as I said, local people in those communities go, I don't want this happening on my doorstep, This is really bad, There's other targets, as we've said, but this one they're so bad that it makes sense to a wide cross-section of people.
Yeah. So just to add to that as well, so they produce 85% of Israel's military drone fleet. They produce, most of the components for different Israeli attack aircraft, but also because they're able to, because Gaza is under, a brutal blockade and has been for way over a decade now, and has often been attacked by Israel. These drones that they build are constantly surveilling and are constantly hovering over the skies of Gaza, and this is part of their control over the Palestinian people to enforce their apartheid regime. And often these drones are then used to actually attack and drop their payloads on the people of Gaza. So for people, I know, for example, I've seen it directly with my own cousins in Iraq, the impact, the psychological trauma that they live through constantly, day after day after day. And for the people of Gaza, and it's children, it's men and women, it's going to affect all of them. But you're constantly under this surveillance. You're constantly seeing these drones hover above your head. And you've also seen these same drones or weapons be used to kill and take out whole communities in Gaza. And the drone market means that they never have to see the people they murder. They never have to look into the eyes of people they murder. They can be in a bunker, so to speak, or a room with a bunch of computer screens and decide who gets to live or die based on that. And they say that, drones are supposed to reduce civilian casualties, but we've seen that that's not the case. And in fact, they probably increase civilian casualties. And then even if they use that argument to say that, then why have they killed, just in May, 67 children and 250 civilians if they could actually tell who they were killing? But it's where and Israel becomes a pioneer in this type of market. And we know now that they're using more artificial intelligence to remove even more of the humane, I think all killing and all, and these weapons are completely inhumane, but they want to remove out the human process from these killings even more. And then, these companies, whether producing parts or the drones in full, etc., will say, well, we just produced this part, or we're just making this part, but we're not the ones, we're not the ones clicking the button. But then the people clicking the button will say, well, it's not our fault. We're just told to follow orders. And then they try and basically pass on responsibility. But actually, I think for us, and what's clear throughout history, is that every step in that kill chain, on that supply chain, if you profit from the end use of that weapon, which is going to be used to destroy someone's life, then that whole chain is complicit and should be held accountable, but they're never held accountable, which is why we have to take actions that we do to ensure that happens.
We also know that the Ministry of Defence have purchased Elbit hardware in order to help with surveillance of boats coming across the English Channel. We also know of migrants, escaping all types of situations to try and get to England. We also know that there has been the purchase of Elbit hardware by the Indian government for the use of the Indian army in their occupation of Kashmir. Where else has Elbit Systems harmed other than just Palestine?
Yeah, so it's great that you brought up about the refugees, because as you mentioned, this is something that it's quite recent. In the past year or two, they made this contract with Elbit. So it's, again, the same technology used against the people of Gaza. And it just displays how sickening it is, right? That the same companies who profit from destroying communities in the Middle East or across the world are then profiting from basically trying to stop them from actually seeking safety from those situations which they made unsafe in the first place. So every step of the way, it's like this torment, and the same companies profiting from that, from those massacres. But just another example as well is, we know about the apartheid wall in Palestine, and it's the same technologies which are being used now for the US-Trump wall, the US-Mexico wall, which they've called Trump's wall, basically, using the same technology there for that. And they've also got these same drones being used there. We know that they've sold to Myanmar, despite there being a military embargo. Israel doesn't seem to, really follow the rules when it comes to arms export licenses, even though most of the time arms export licenses are, relatively pointless when they are still allowed to sell to countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia, for example, against the people in Yemen. We also know about Afghanistan, which obviously there's been a lot, it's been, re-brought to people's attention recently. But often, actually, it's the drone market again, which has been very active in Afghanistan. And we've seen that recently. Elbit Systems, for example, their factory in Shenstone, which we occupied, as many others, and PalAction have also occupied. They produce engines for Israel's drones, but they also sell to the US for their Reaper drones. So again, it's the same parts, even not even necessarily weapons in full, that are being sold to be used by the US in Afghanistan. We also know that the British government were basically renting Elbit's drones to use in Afghanistan whilst they were developing the Watchkeeper program, which was, to build drones which are based on that same model of Elbit's drones, with Elbit Systems and Thales and a bunch of other arms companies, which is active in Leicester. But because that program had taken so long and so much money, they were just hiring Elbit's drones from the get-go to use in places like Afghanistan as well. And we know that they've been used in Yemen. And, the list kind of just goes on and on. But the pattern is always that there is no regard for the fact that they're going to be used to commit war crimes. They're going to be used in against people's human rights. They're going to be used in places most people would condemn what's happening in Yemen or what happened in Afghanistan, right? But they don't care. Literally, there is no care for how these weapons will be used, just that they will make a profit at the end of the day. And it fuels war, this constant, thirst for profit and this greed and disregard for life, and the fact that they're never held accountable. We're in Britain. We're supposed to be in a country which is, I was brought up to believe was democratic in a sense, and had a strong respect and abided by international law, etc., and human rights. But what is happening is is barbaric, and we can't consider ourselves a civilized nation while we continue to allow these things to happen in our name, and then not hold anyone accountable. And there's no consequences for these companies. Rather, the consequences happen to be on the activists who actually do something to try and stop the crimes that are being committed.
Could I add a couple of things to that, actually, and that picks up on that? One is there's two other things that speak to me, and I know this isn't international, but Elbit also have a contract with the British police to use drones to surveil you and me and anybody watching this, which is horrendous as they phase out police helicopters. They use drones. They're buying these off Elbit. Also, Elbit has recently won over £120 million contract to work with the British forces in Fars Lane, where the nuclear arsenal is kept. We're not exactly sure what they're doing there, but they're probably training the submarines that carry the nuclear warheads that are being bought at the moment by the British government at a horrendous cost, where we deal with austerity, the impact of COVID. We're spending billions of pounds on reproducing nuclear weapons to blow up the world many times over, and Elbit are involved in that. And I also think, as Huda touched on there, it's more insidious than that. We both have Huda's described her personal experience of working in Greece. I worked and lived in Dover, and I worked for a refugee and asylum charity in Dover. We then lived together in a community with 24 asylum seekers in London that the police then raided. And to think these things are not related in terms of how the British state protects Elbit Systems and wants to raid a house where we live twice over and go into rooms that were nothing to do with us, but were just guys who were petrified because of the way they've been treated by the British state and currently have no access to public recourse to public funds. These things are all related by how the British state works it. And when they have deals with Elbit Systems, it just shows how deep these things go.
Absolutely. Can you please explain to us some of the cases that Palestine Action members have gone through, including yourselves?
Yeah, so there's several ongoing cases. Still to date, there have been no trials. And this is something which actually we knew about before Palestine Action launched. So myself, Richard, other people had taken sporadic action against Elbit Systems, not on a sustained level as we are now with Palestine Action. But people, a lot of people just weren't charged in the first place before Palestine Action, or the cases were always dropped. Every single case was dropped. It would either be after disclosure requests, or for me, it was once the day before trial. I think I got the closest. hold that there. But they consistently wouldn't take us to court, basically, and it sounds, I think, bizarre for people to hear that, but actually what we really want is to actually get into court against Elbit Systems. And we know that, it's obvious why they don't want to go to court, because our defences is always going to be based on the fact of Elbit's criminality. And that means that we will be exposing Elbit's crimes in the court. And, and if we won on that basis as well, it would have consequences for Elbit's continue to operate in this country. We don't know if that's going to still hold. So part of, our first actions against Elbit, it was quite clear that we were upping the actions in terms of, the level of how much we would dismantle their infrastructure. That meant that these cases, we have more and more Crown Court cases. And it basically puts Elbit on the back foot, because, if they don't proceed with the cases, then they're basically saying green light for everyone to cause tens and hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of damage to their buildings, and they just can't operate like that. But then if they proceed with it and they lose and everything gets exposed, then again, they lose. So for us, it's important that we created that dilemma for them. But we have seen a kind of, different responses at certain parts. So myself and Richard are both, we've got ongoing cases against Elbit Systems when it comes to the Elbit factory in Shenstone, UAV Engines Limited, where they build the engines for Elbit's drones. And we were supposed to actually go to court. It was going to be the first trial, and that was supposed to happen in May. And then Israel started attacking Gaza. Palestine was all over the news, which, as you know, only happens when the worst situation happens. And just 3-4 days before the case was supposed to happen, suddenly it's delayed for a year because we're going to be in front of a jury, right? It's a Crown Court. It's 12 ordinary people from the community, and they knew they just were not going to win. There was no way that normal people would say, compared to what we did, compared to what these companies are doing, and especially when they're talking about criminal damage, right? It's like literally in the law of criminal damage, it says it's lawful if you're doing it to prevent other further criminal damage. And you talk about breaking a window and smashing a security camera and all of these kind of things. What does that compare to one person's life? And that's always why we continue to act the way we act. But again, that's been delayed till May, and we're like a year and a half in now to Palestine action, or just over a year in, no trials. More cases have been dropped. We're seeing people just not even get charged now. We know that there was activists who allegedly caused £500,000 worth of damage to one of Elbit's factories. And they were released under bail conditions to not go back to the factory. And then one of the activists went outside to protest outside that factory, and they arrested them for breaking their bail conditions, released them after 3 hours, and then said, okay, you've got no bail conditions now. And they've not even, it's madness, like when you think about it in any other context. But we've also been recent, do you want to talk about Blackmail?
Yeah, I suppose I want to say the broad scheme of the things have been under the law of arrests have been under aggravated trespass, obstruction of the highway, and most of those are getting dropped. As Huda said, 2 of the people who were on the roof of Leicester for 3.5 days, like the action during May, those cases have just been dropped already. Those things, and then the allegation is often criminal damage, and some of us have been charged with burglary and blackmail, which sound, I think they've been charged, I think it's politically motivated, right? Yeah. Let's make these sound as bad as they are. Burglary, right? We went into an arms company headquarters and spray painted some slogans. Now, I'm not sure in the public consciousness how that's burglary. And blackmail, when you say to anybody, they certainly don't think of that about asking a company to stop housing war criminals. Yeah, that's a standard campaign tactic. I just talked before there about the way that you approach, standard campaigns against universities or other companies, banks, Puma, whatever. You tell them to stop working with them. But for us, they've sort of trumped up these charges. For those, we know how the state works. We've seen this, yeah. And I don't hold any great sway by the courts. We've seen Julian Assange and many others. Yeah, okay, terrible stuff going on. So they try and trump up these charges, and make them sound as bad as they are, as they are. I think we do hold on to that fact that it's still 12 random jurors, yeah, and they would see through this and go, blackmail, people throwing red paint to expose the war crimes. But those are obviously really serious charges. Blackmail probably, is virtually certain a prison sentence for a few years. On the whole, though, we would say the hundreds of people who've taken part in Palestine actions do not receive no charges or relatively minor charges. So I think they, as we know the way the state goes, they go for what they perceive as leaders and they try and take them out. That's the kind of standard tactic. And I think I just want to echo what Huda says. However, the importance for us is we've seen the history of movements. Yeah, you have to go play the system a little bit. You win the court case. You generate a load of people. You get hundreds of people outside those court cases. You're not going to get mainstream press. We get our friends in the independent media sector to get on board with this and make a big stink about it. And this is how you win this beyond. You know, we've looked at those things beyond just activist trials. We've seen trials and research stuff in America. You have to bring in those kind of like wider contexts and bring in media and all kinds of cultural ways of kind of bringing attention to this. And so we'd always call out really from now onwards to say to people, you know, if you can't join us to take direct action, let's see what we can do around these trials and make them a big thing so that we can win these trials. And this will be, you know, this will be the tipping point for those companies to be able to go, we can't carry on like this.
And just to clarify, exactly how many actions have Palestine Action carried out? Exactly how many times have someone connected to Palestine Action been raided by the police? How many arrests have been carried out? And how much damage, estimation of the worth of damage to Elbit Systems? And then on top of that, how many convictions? So if you can lay out those figures for us, please.
So in our first year, I think I've lost count recently, but in our first year of Palestine Action, we had over 100 arrests. There were over 70 actions, and that included, I think, around 21 high-profile occupations of these factories where significant damage was caused. I think we cost them over £15 million in damage and losses whilst they couldn't operate in the first year of Palestine Action. There was over 30 raids in our first year, several devices taken, say 5 to 10. That's probably an underestimate, actually. Our passports taken as well, and 0 convictions.
So there you have it. Direct action works. You've laid out there some of the things that the state has done, because, you know, we understand that convictions, there being 0 convictions, has no, you know, we look at the Spike Ops inquiry, we're finding 1,000 political groups, 99.9% of them on the left, that were infiltrated by Spike Ops, Special Demonstration Squad linked to MI5. What kind of activities has the state engaged in when trying to deal with Palestine Action?
I can start with that. So I think for us, we know this is, you know, that there was the police put a camera in a school, in a primary school, poking out the window at our front door, which we shared, as I said, which we shared with 24 male asylum seekers who had, you know, and we saw this camera, or somebody who knows about cameras spotted it, and Huda rang the school and said, could you just tell us why there's a camera pointing out there? And I think the receptionist wasn't on message and went, oh yeah, the police came around the other week and put that in. Oh, well, now I better put you through to the business manager now. And obviously that's something that we've noticed. You know, we noticed, and you know, and that's horrendous, especially where we were, and you know, in terms of like the people who are living with us. That's kind of like one stark side of that. And obviously we've also seen, you know, more insidious ways, us being stopped whilst travelling under Schedule 7. So travelling into Wales, we were stopped. And it was clear. In fact, in my case, less with Huda, they were honest with me in one respect and said, "This is because of what you've been doing. This is your activism." They were, you know, which actually thinking back, and if I'd have been sort of more aware, I'm like, "Well, wait a minute, this activism isn't terrorism. What are you going on about?" So they stopped us under Schedule 7, took our devices. We were interrogated without access to legal advice. So obviously we've been arrested many times and you can make no comment. You're not allowed to make no comment, or you're arrested immediately. And I think Huda can probably go into more depth about how, because as a brown woman, she was treated differently in that interview to me. But but the kind of, sort of chilling thing for us is the way that, it says under Schedule 7, this is all around terrorism. This isn't allowed to be used outside of this. And then the police have passed on all that information to the Met Police and used it all against us in evidence.
In the Blackmail case.
Yeah. So completely use that as a kind of fictitious way of doing things. And I suppose before maybe Huda could to greater depth about that, I'll just add a couple of things which we've seen very recently. So there was a Liverpool Arms Fair, and when we talk about raids, people were raided at the Liverpool Arms Fair for having a spray can on them. Their house was raided when they had in the middle of the night with young children, which is, unprecedented to be able to do this. And undoubtedly that's because of them being part of Palestine Action. We also saw the police coming up to people and showing them photos of themselves and saying, oh, we need to check you because you're hanging around this area of Liverpool, undercover police. We had police speaking to people who are just supporters of Palestine Action, saying, you can't go back to your hotel. To be honest, and without mentioning, these were elderly people who supported Palestine Action, retired people who were just there to protest, and saying, you can't go back to your hotel. You can't go for a meal in that place because it's in this zone. We're seeing that kind of like ever crackdown in that way just very recently.
And even in those raids, one activist had books taken from him because it had some Arabic writing in it, and posters which said "Free Palestine," on his wall, taken off, and he had £180 in cash, which they just took as well, And it's like, what evidence is that for anything? That's just the guy's money that you're taking off him, at that point. But there was, especially, I think. We've seen it recently again with the Liverpool Arms Fair. At the start of Palestine Action, it felt like it was kind of non-stop in terms of the things that were happening. So as Richard mentioned, we were stopped under Schedule 7, and I'd actually straightened my hair. It was like, it's like when you're brown and stuff and you're Arab and you kind of go through the security and you kind of expect to be stopped in a way, or maybe just extra security check measures. Random security check, as they say, but it was nothing like that. It was the second we had arrived, they had, I just opened my passport for a second and they just took us to the side straight away from the get-go. What's your password for your devices? What's this password for this device? What's this password? And you don't even know what's going on and why you've been stopped. And then they're asking you all of these questions about your passwords for everything. And I had from the start refused to give the password to my laptop, and there was a number of reasons I did that. But I said it was about the Data Protection Act, which it was, to be honest with you. There's other people's data. It's against the Data Protection Act. I'm not going to give out this information to the police. I just can't do that. And repeatedly throughout the interview, they kept trying to find new ways of getting my password off me. And then they took my fingerprints and said, well, don't worry if you can't give your password, we'll just open it with your fingerprint because it's a new Mac. And then said to me, unless you want to give it now, and then it'll make your life a lot easier and you won't get arrested. And that was a lie because they never even got into the laptop. So, they were completely lying throughout the whole thing. But it was evident from when we got stopped and then the questions started, and it just baffles you. It's we know that they have these powers, but and I think you mentioned it recently, you really don't know the impact it can have on you, or the kind of what they can get away with asking everything under the sun, and you have to respond. And I was actually, after 3-4 hours of that, I was relieved to get arrested. I just wanted them to arrest me because I knew once I got arrested, my rights kicked in, and suddenly I could say no comment. And it was, and I remember they told you straight away, they told me an hour in, they started asking about Palestine Action. And they said, well, that's why you're here. That's why you're here. And actually, a bunch of racist questions. And they kept asking me about if I was Sunni or if I was Shia. And I tried to explain to them that my dad was Sunni and my mum was Shia. And then they asked me questions like, so does your family in Iraq want to kill you because you have a Sunni last surname? They keep going on. And I had Iraq in my passport as well. What were you doing there? What's your family's names? What do they do? And it's just crazy. And you can see how they think as well. They're going, well, which terrorist groups could they be aligned with then? And it going through in their head, these different things. But when then they arrested us, and we got released under investigation, and because we had stencils on us, just literally stencils, it was insane. And which could be used for anything. They could be used for T-shirts, placards, whatever. And they said, and because the place where we entered happened to be near an RAF site where Elbit was based, which we did not know. And, you're not going to go do an action with all of your luggage on you and your phones and stuff. So they said, you obviously came here to do an action. They used that they're only allowed to keep your devices for 7 days. They used the fact that we had stencils to say, this is an ongoing criminal investigation. Took our laptops, the papers that we had on us. And then lo and behold, we find it later used in the Blackmail case. So they used counterterrorism laws, not to stop terrorism, as often it's never used for, they've used it to get information out of us and to get our devices off us in order to pass on to the Metropolitan Police to then be used against us in criminal cases. And, I've got to a point where we were talking about this, and it's like when we travel in the future, it's difficult because you're told, if you don't do this, you've got it's a charge under the Schedule 7 Terrorism Act. This is minimum 3 months imprisonment, et cetera. And you don't have a right to have a lawyer present. You don't have any of these rights. But it seems that they obviously massively misuse it and are going to try and use it again if we travel in the future, just to get information to use against us in our criminal cases. So it's, yeah.
And also, I think in terms of the wider question, and there was one point when you were talking there, I just want to add about this, the way that they do things is, and the policing of Palestine Action generally has been racist. Yeah. Okay. So from one of the first arrests where they had intelligence, so to speak, and Huda was thrown violently to the ground, which I've seen a very different response from the police to this in comparison to environmental movements. One, because we have lots of non-white people in Palestine Action who take action, and they get treated very differently. But even those allies get treated very differently. So violent arrests. When the Schedule 7, I was remembering now, one of the first things he said to me, obviously to try and make me relax, was like, oh, it's really nice to actually stop someone, who's white, and implied it's not Muslim, to try and get me to talk and stuff. And it's just like, and because he knows it can't be recorded or written down, it's like, that's just so fucking racist. And we've seen that kind of approach across the board in the way that we've been policed. And I said, you've referenced there, spy cops and those things in the past. And, and no doubt those things are kind of ongoing from them in terms of the way that they're trying to approach us. But we just emphasize for anybody watching this from the cops, we're a dispersed network of people who make their own decisions.
Yeah. And I think also we've discovered afterwards about the Schedule 7 Terrorism Act that both cops had said to us, because they're in separate rooms, that their dads, both of their dads, just happen to support Corbyn as well. So they use these kind of tactics to try and say, I sympathise with you. This isn't, so you can try and open up and asking me about Corbyn's suspension from the Labour Party and all sorts of political questions. But you can see that the tactics that they use, and they're trained in this. They're trained to lie through their teeth to try and get you to somehow feel at ease. You're more likely to talk to them.
The final thing I'll just add in terms of the police is that, including in our evidence in the Blackmail, they have included from a well-known Zionist evidence that he supplied them. When I was arrested under Blackmail and interviewed, I was screamed at by the lead police guy who was basically just repeating Zionist tropes at me, saying, you can't be anti-racist, you're anti-Semitic. And he was literally just going through things that arch Zionists would be saying. And, again, it's like, this is just outrageous. He's taken their evidence and bringing it. And it just see that kind of link within the British state about how they approach things.
When I got detained under Schedule 7 in 2016, the detaining officer mentioned to me that he noticed a stamp for Cuba in my passport and said how enthused he was by the Cuban Revolution and how much of a big fan he was of Fidel Castro. So these tactics are definitely in wide use, and people should be vigilant about that. In the most recent Palestinian uprising, you saw the factory in Leicester, which produces weapons for Elbit Systems, be shut down for 6 consecutive days, thanks to Palestine Action. The local community came out to support this. The fire brigade was called to remove Palestine Action and refused to do so. What did this kind of solidarity mean to the wider struggle for justice?
I think it was an absolute incredible show of solidarity across the board when it came to the occupation of that Leicester factory. And I think actually the fact that it was just 4 people who went up and climbed onto the roof of that factory, and we could see it within hours, the numbers just started piling up outside the factory of people from the local community who were just outraged by the fact that there was an Israeli arms company on their doorstep. And that, that outrage became quite important throughout those days to actually keep the activists on the roof going in terms of their occupation. And the fire service actually on the first day pulled out and said, we are not going to, they were called by the police and you could see them literally turning around. They said, we're not going to assist taking these activists off the roof of this factory. And if it wasn't just, in that moment, it wasn't just those activists on the roof taking direct action to shut that factory down. It was a fire service who kept it going for so long as well, because they refused to assist the police in taking them down. And actually the activists at one point were drinking, they ran out of water. So 2 out of the 4 went down to negotiate so they could ration the rest of the supplies. And the people from the local community were throwing up water bottles to them on the roof, and they were getting arrested for throwing up water. But they could see other people get arrested, but more and more people still kept throwing the water bottles up because they showed that solidarity with those activists on the roof. And then when it came to the 6 days and they started getting in the protest removal team to arrest the activists, the communities, I think within like an hour, there was 20 people there. Suddenly there was hundreds of people there, and they started fencing up the gates, and they were putting up their really nice cars, they had Audi Q7s in the road to block the police. And these were families, these were like young people, families, elder people coming out and saying, you're not going to arrest these activists. And I think, if anything, it just shows actually when people just react based on human instinct, which is, and are outraged by the fact that actually the police are arresting the activists and do nothing about the criminals who operate inside these factories or who own these factories. And they actually blocked off the police from arresting them for, I think it was 7 hours or so. And even when they did manage to finally get through the police, the 30 cars were following that police van into the police station. And I think it was an amazing show of solidarity. And it just shows actually that it's all these different components together, which are going to mean that we win in the end, and we win these struggles. We can direct action, other people climb from the roof with the spark of it, but everyone who took part was taking part in direct action over that week to make sure that factory shut down. And I think that's an incredible thing which could be applied across the movement for justice.
Just add one thing to that. I think, in addition, the fire brigade union, it wasn't just them saying we're not going to take them off the roof. They actually made a statement about Palestine, and so it was as strong as they could get. And I think that was really crucial as well to the wider struggle, and should be replicated by other unions, by other movements that should be allied.
Absolutely beautiful. On the 14th of June in 2021. Palestine Action shut down a factory for Arconic. This was the cladding company that put 6 millimeters of polyethylene cord PE Renabond cladding on Grenfell Tower. The cladding has been recognized in the Morbic inquiry to be the main promoter of the fire across the building. The crown of the cladding on the roof was responsible for turning the fire around the building also. why was it that Palestine Action got involved in something domestic like Grenfell? What was the relation to Palestine?
I think in terms of, the relation, I think the crucial thing was that this was a massive injustice. And again, as we see with Palestine and as we see with people across the world, the perpetrators and the people that profit from those injustices and those massacres of people are never held accountable. And, it's just sickening to see it happen time and time again. And I think for us in Palestine Action, after that occupation of Arconic, it was clear that actually it's up to the people to seek justice. It's up to the people to hold these companies accountable and to try and make sure that these things don't happen again. Because if, the whole justice system is supposed to work, right? It's meant to be based on the fact that if you commit a crime or if you harm another being, there will be consequences. But there are never any consequences for companies like Arconic or Elbit Systems. But crucially with Arconic, not only do they provide the cladding for Grenfell Tower and other tower buildings across England and Europe, I believe, but they also supply the material for Israel's fighter jets, which we saw being used in May in Gaza and time again in 2014 when Israel killed 2,200 Palestinians and 500 children in just 50 days. And it's the same company that's profiting again from the destruction of Palestine and from the destruction of the Grenfell Tower, which led to 72 people being killed here, in Britain, in London, and it just shows, whether it's close to home or whether it's far away, the same corporate criminals who are profiting from it have to be held accountable, and there has to be some form of justice or prevention from these things happening again. But there's countless, as you'll know, there's countless documents and evidence of how Arconic knew about how lethal this cladding was, but still supplied it anyway, because it's more about the profit they could gain than of people's lives. And it's the same principle when it comes to supplying parts for Israel's fighter jets. They know that those parts are going to be used in a fighter jet, which will be used to kill people. But if they can get away with it, they will do it, because the priority for them is not humanity. The priority is getting more, profits in their pockets.
I would just add as well, Palestine Action has as a stated aim ending, British complicity with the Israeli apartheid regime, and therefore, there's a wider struggle beyond Elbit Systems. Now, we might be focused at the moment. There's also personal, there's people within Palestine Action with personal issues and personal experience of Grenfell. And therefore, this is, a perfect target for all those reasons we've described. And we are not going to allow companies like that to get away with things. Yeah. This is why we're saying direct action wider for other movements, and encourage other movements. And we're always willing to speak to other movements and saying, these are the things that you can do. We're not going to let these, basically evil companies and evil people who run them get away with it. If they're not going to be taken to court, they're not going to be dragged before the courts, we're going to, in the same way as Elbit, we're going to force them into it by them saying, if you're not going to come to court and try and prosecute us, we'll carry on doing this, and we'll drag you into court that way. And if you don't want to, then the local community will take on, as it did in Birmingham. We saw lots of young people, going on the roof themselves after the activists were taken. We saw a whole campaign going on in that local area and raising that consciousness of what's happening there. And we encourage those local communities to carry on those campaigns and get rid of these companies from them, hold them to account by using direct action, by using their bodies. And let's get rid of these companies and hold, and, bring them into the light.
And also on that, I think, we often talk about, as activists, about intersectionality, but I don't think it's used often there's not enough practical steps in actually achieving that intersectionality. And the interesting thing is that the companies are intersectional, right? They literally profit from, whether it's Elbit profiting from the refugee crisis, profiting from the Israel's apartheid regime or the occupation of Kashmir, they profit from all of it. And it's the same situation with Arconic. They're profiting from, the unsafe cladding that they provided for Grenfell, which led to the, murder of the Grenfell victims, and they're profiting from the massacres in Gaza. So we have to, as well, be intersectional in what we do, and that intersectionality has to be rooted in action, in practical action to achieving that.
And also the thing with Arconic is that one of its top shareholders is Elliott Management, the president of which is Paul E. Singer. Now, Paul E. Singer personally, through his foundation, funds the Friends of the IDF. He also funds the JNF, which builds illegal settlements in the West Bank. But more than that, Paul E. Singer, along with several main figures from Elliott Management, has set up something called Startup Nation Central, which is a company which its stated aim is to combat BDS. And the way in which it does that is it feeds former Unit 8200 military intelligence from the IDF, the Israeli occupying forces, into big tech companies. It feeds big tech jobs using US taxpayer funds into the Israeli state in a bid to combat BDS and make sure that there would never be any chance of companies like Google, like Microsoft, or like Facebook ever engaging with something like BDS. So, of course, it's the absolute antithesis of what Palestine Action does, which is a sort of community enforcement of BDS and a thrusting of these invisible criminals into the court of public opinion. Now, the action in Birmingham was so effective that not only again did the Fire Brigades Union refuse to comply with the police's request to remove the protesters from the roof, but the community got involved very, very intensely in what was happening there. Now, it bothered Arconic to such an extent that they went to the fuss of printing a letter and sending it around to the community to try and encourage people to go against what Palestine Action was doing. That's quite an unprecedented level of fuss, really, from the companies that I've seen so far in terms of understanding the communities they operate in. Lastly, what is your message to the communities around the country who have been so supportive of what you do?
I think one of the biggest messages is to actually say that none of this would be possible without support from the local communities. And actually that is vital to keeping these actions going, to keeping the pressure up on these companies, and to showing that solidarity with the people and the victims often of the products that these companies build. And actually that people, I think we've been raised in a society which makes us to believe that we do not have that much power, or that you have to go through certain routes in order to achieve change and power. But actually, that's not the case. And the case is if a local community want to get rid of a company or don't want to have that company there, then they do have the ability to make sure that happens. And so my main message to them would be to keep going and to keep doing that and to keep showing their solidarity with others, and that to support a community is absolutely crucial to every single action that has happened. We've seen it, as you said, time and time again. And actually the ways that people are willing to put their own liberty on the line, we know that people in Palestine actually go into it knowing that it will lead to an arrest. They know the consequences. But the local community, I've seen it, time and time again, come out and put themselves at risk and just understand that actually doing the right thing is the most important thing. And that, it was in during the Arconic action, people were sat in the road again, and they sat in the road and they said, if you want to move us, you're going to have to arrest us because we're not going. And that was just incredible to see how that energy and that passion and that determination spreads like wildfire. And that's what we need. And I think it's often the communities which are underrepresented, which are actually the strongest on this. We've seen it in Leicester and Birmingham. It's mostly coming from the Asian community, who are coming out in droves, and actually it's incredible because they're so well connected to each other, as our as the culture tends to be, right? That you are more closer to your neighbours, your families, etc. And literally in an hour, they've managed to get hundreds of people outside just by that determination of will, and that spreads so much to keep that level of passion and that drive going, and because in the end it will be a combination of all of these things that means that we do shut Elbit down, and we do get rid of Arconic and these other companies. It'll be from that solidarity.
I think that's perfect. The only thing I would add is just to emphasize them, you have the power. We've seen it in Oldham as well. A similar community, people carrying on the campaign there. You have the power, keep going. We'll come out and talk in those communities, and come and chat to us about ideas and stuff. And we just want to encourage those people and saying, that's where as Huda said, it's a combination of those things. That's how we're going to shut it down. The history shows us it's local communities rising up in Birmingham, outside Arconic. For me, one of the best things was when there's a whole bunch of people, different ages, mainly young people, going, "We're all Palestine Action," shouting that as they block the roads. We know that racialized policing meant that people in Leicester were arrested for throwing water, that people in Birmingham were arrested for standing there. That doesn't happen to white people protesting the environment. All right. We know that happens. We can talk about that and try and work with that. We know that you're sort of brave and you've received and you've had these examples before, but you have the power, and together we can shut these places down and get rid of them.
So there you have it. Thank you so much, Palestine Action, for joining us. I hope everybody watching this will get involved in Palestine Action and help with what they are trying to do. Until next time, this is Lowkey from the Watchdog on Mint Press.